All right, good afternoon. My name is Rod Cox. I'm with the Simon Center, which is part of the Command and General Staff College Foundation, and it's our pleasure, in cooperation with the Command and General Staff School, to present this iteration of the InterAgency Brown-Bag Lecture Series. I want to thank our sponsors, First Command. They had water over there, and once again, for bringing stuff, thank you very much. We appreciate the support. Wouldn't be able to do these without you. This is our 9th iteration of this series. We have 2 events that I want to bring your attention to. Tomorrow evening, downtown at the Stove Factory Lofts Ballroom on 2nd Street in downtown Leavenworth will be the 15th presentation in our General of the Army John J. Pershing Great War Series. So if you're a history buff and like World War I stuff, I think you'll find this presentation to be of interest. Professor Brian Steed will be giving a talk about the Middle East that he entitles Armageddon, Arabia, and the Modern Middle East, where he's going to explore the events from World War I and how we're living with the consequences of that today. Second thing is, our next and final brown bag series of this academic year will be on 6th June, right here, same times, and we'll conclude with Dr. Ted Thomas, the chair of the Command and Leadership Department here, talking about interagency leadership and the differences between that and an organization like direct leadership of the U.S. Army. Now, today's presentation will be recorded for use by our distance learning students and hung at the website, at the Simon Center website, for use by our interagency partners. So what that means to you all, if you have a question or you engage in discussion, please tap and turn on one of the microphones that are at the tables in front of you. And if you happen to be sitting where there's not, you can either move now or move when you do ask your question. Otherwise, it won't be picked up for the benefit of the rest of our audience. Now, today's presentation is going to address one of the newer domains out there, space. It's the ultimate high ground, and we're going to hear about the evolution of programs and then hear about something that's a little bit frightening for me as a novice. Who's in charge? And how's that going to impact our security? Mr. Thomas A. Gray serves as the U.S. Army Missile Defense Command Liaison Officer to the U.S. Army Combined Arms Center and Army University, with responsibility for the integration of space knowledge and education across TRADOC schools. He's a retired Army officer. Colonel Gray served in Army Space Command, Space and Missile Defense Lab, and the SDMC Directorate of Combat Development. He's a qualified Level 3 Space Operations Officer, has earned the designation 3 Yankee, has earned the U.S. Army's Master Space Badge. Mr. Gray holds a Bachelor of Science from New Hampshire College and earned a Master of Science from Central Michigan University. Please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Mr. Tom Gray.
Sir. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Really happy to see you. And then the question comes is, okay, this is the Interagency Lecture Series. I am not a representative of an agency. So then that led me to think, why am I even here? Because if we're here to talk about and introduce agencies, what is my play in this? And I got to thinking. And so I start with a postulate. Please tell me, as we look at the United States and what we do in our leadership in the world, which agency for the United States is in charge of space and the domain of space for our national security? Crickets. And that ended up being my same piece, because as I started looking at it, I said, who is in charge of space as an agency for the United States as we look at our national security? Which agency is involved in space? Oh, now that would have been an easy question, because pretty much everybody would have said, well, everybody. So what I would like to do today is to take a little bit of time to look at the domain of space, what it is to us historically, capabilities-wise, and then also address what are the law and responsibilities that apply to us as a nation when we're thinking about how we do business as a nation in space. So that tends to think about how and where are we dependent on space as a nation. So when you think about space, what we do, I love TV, we communicate. Television, direct contact to other nations, the ability to coordinate with allies, the ability for us as a department to put, as a nation, to put forth diplomatic, informational, economic, and even military power to the world relies on the ability to communicate worldwide. So we think about the ability to communicate. And the very first capabilities that went up there were a communication capability. You think all the way back to way before some of us were even born, you think about Telstar and the ability to go from analog TV across a broadcast antenna to actually getting nationwide capability and worldwide capability. The first broadcast of live Olympics over air so you could watch what was going on. So telecommunications, and probably even more importantly, believe it or not, the ability for navigation and timing. Because global finance works on common timing protocol. Whenever you go anywhere and just use your credit card, you put in the chip, you swipe it, whatever it is, all those little ones and zeros go from that terminal all the way to the approving financial institution. It sends back and says, yes, that's a viable card, that account is good, and you can use that. And that happens instantaneously. And when you think about stock markets and trade and the ability to move money, that all happens on common timing protocol. And then just the fun part of putting on your telephone, hitting it and saying, I am going to Walmart in this new town. Where is it? How do I get there? And just to be able to get in your car and navigate anywhere you want without having a random McNally road atlas with you. We use it incredibly much. Then think about national security. Lately we're talking about we are going to go address and speak with North Korea. But if you look historically, the threat to our nation from intercontinental ballistic missiles, from annihilation through nuclear munitions, the mutually assured destruction that we've had to live with, how and when and do we protect our nation from a missile attack? That is all detected from a space-based capability at the very outset of any sort of launch. And then, everybody loves getting on Google Earth. I looked back to where I used to live and say, hey, there's my house. Why is my truck still in the driveway? Yeah, old imagery, but when you start looking at how we can actually even do verification, is Russia, China, North Korea doing what they say they're doing? How do we get to look and prove that and verify that? So when you look at the open skies concept of space, I can see anywhere and everywhere around the world on a daily basis. So when you think about how we do business, I can't fly U-2 over everybody. They proved that in '62 with Gary Powers. But I can put a satellite over them and allow me to do that type of collection. So the dependencies we have as a nation on space, how dependent are we on the global domain? How important is it to us as a nation for our security? And then, who's in charge of all of that? And what's that mean? What are the rules and what are the regulations? So I'd like to kind of go back a little bit and talk about just a piece of history on space. And when you start looking at when did we really start going the space domain? I mean, we had the sea and air and land and all of that. So when you start thinking about space, the first to put something in orbit in space was Sputnik, Russia, Soviet Union actually. In 1957, they launched Sputnik and they put it in orbit around the Earth. Think about this for a second. Earth as a spin-stabilized satellite, Sputnik orbiting, and its satellite is going to go over the United States. And if you go back to 1957, you want to talk about security. What's going on in the world in 1957 diplomatically? You got this whole Cold War. East versus West, NATO versus Warsaw Pact, and now the Soviet Union has put a satellite and it's going to go over the United States. OMG. I mean, what's that really mean? Now, they have the opportunity to put something into space, and that means they can reach out and touch somebody. And that reaches out and touches us. Little children in elementary schools are diving under desks for civil defense drills because they're going to nuke us. The commie red horde has such an advantage. And we as the United States, how well do we deal with that? We're number 2. And that doesn't sit well. Now, we follow up 3 months later with Explorer 1. And by the way, considering I'm at the Army Command and General Staff College, it was the United States Army that put up that satellite in January '58. So now you have the United States and the Soviet Union both in space orbiting satellites. You have to start thinking about what are the rules? What's that mean? Who has the power? Who's playing? What's that mean to national security? Who's in charge? I mean, we don't even have NASA. It's the Department of Defense working this. You look a little bit later, you get the first man in space, Soviet Union. You look a little bit later, well, we send up Alan Shepard after the Soviet Union. Look a little bit later, you get John Glenn finally orbits in space. Look a little bit later, first woman in space, Soviet Union. Okay, first spacewalk, Soviet Union. United States, first on the moon though. Our Germans are better than their Germans. And so we look at what this means. So here we are, 1958, 2 countries at total odds with satellites orbiting the Earth. What are the rules? This is hard to think about. And who's in charge? So over time, you start looking at, this is a whole new domain, and how do you make rules for a whole new domain? Who is this? How do we work this? So we start thinking about, how can I pull this together? International law. International law. So I take some precedents. Walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, moves like a duck, isn't a duck. It's kind of a goose, but what can I use? So we look at the law, maritime law. Who can go out to international waters? Anybody. Anybody. I have my littoral sector, so if you just take that latitudinally and put it altitudinally, now you're talking about airspace and space. And then you say, if the Soviet Union can put a satellite over me and I can put a satellite over the Soviet Union, what does that mean? Who can go to space? Well, who can go to international waters? Anybody. So who can go to space? Anybody, if you can get there. Okay, so, and then you talk about, well, if you're going to go to this domain, then we ought to do it for peaceful purposes. Because if you look at who is the arbitrator of all things international, it's the UN. And the UN has this whole thing about being, trying to establish peace in the world. And so you say, okay, it's for peaceful purposes, and if you put something up, then you better tell us that you're putting something up. It's not just, if you're going to put out a ship into international waters, you still have to register it. It still has to be flag carrier. These aren't pirates. And this, we finally established the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space and the UN Space Committee. The fun part about space law is that if it's not specifically illegal, if it doesn't say you can't do it, then the ultimate in seeking forgiveness rather than permission, which is kind of fun. So 10 years later, we finally established the Outer Space Treaty in 1967. And then we start amplifying those 12 articles of the Outer Space Treaty, and you have those 12 articles, and it basically takes all of these things that we've been looking as common law and common practice, and they codify this into the 12 articles, and it basically says anybody can go to space. It's free, it's open, it's like international waters. Nations can't claim space or a planet or the moon or anything like that, and basically says if you put something up in space and it comes down and damages us, you're responsible for that. But where is space? Where does space begin? And that gets difficult because I can easily measure 12 miles out from the shore to get the littoral sector and what belongs to me, and then everything else beyond that. Where does space begin? Well, where does air stop? Well, it doesn't. It just gets thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner. So we, as a nation, kind of look at that and say, okay, in order to maintain altitude, it has to have power, then it's flying, and it's in airspace. If it maintains altitude by lateral velocity and then gravitational pull, and it doesn't need additional power to stay up, then it is orbiting, and therefore it's in space. So that kind of gives us a delineation of that. So space is for peaceful purposes. I would love somebody to define that. How do you define that? I mean, when you get to it, you actually have an article that says you may not put a weapon of mass destruction in space. No nukes in space. No chemical, biological weapons, things like that, which is really good. I mean, I think that's pretty peaceful. It doesn't say you can't put a weapon in space. And if you go back, if it doesn't specifically say you can't do it, then you can. What does that mean? Who's putting weapons in space? Are they holding our nation hostage? What does that mean for our national security? And who's in charge of the domain of space for our nation looking at that? How is that played? So we look at who's going to enforce all of this? How does that play for our national security? How important is it for our economic well-being and our physical well-being, our diplomatic well-being? What does that mean to us as a nation? Who's in charge? So we have, since 1958, every president has established national space policy. We actually have every president has done that. Eisenhower, actually the very first one was the NASA Act. We went up in space in January 58. NASA was not formed until June of 58. And it is the peaceful exploration. But you see each president beyond there dragging on, saying, let's amplify this a little. You get to Kennedy, and he says, hey, well, what did he say? Scott. He'll get there. Play.
That this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
More impressive for mankind. No more important than anything else we're doing. Oh, by the way, if you think about this, what else is going on in the world? This is the start of the space race. We're going to go to the moon. And oh, by the way, this is before there is an outer space treaty of 1967. So you see the advent of governments doing the exploration and going forth into space. The further we go, you start seeing space drop. We get to the moon. Yes. Then what? Okay, we got there. Is there anything else we need for our nation? And you start seeing it drop off. But what you do see is this advent of a little bit more from a military perspective and the advent of how important space is. It becomes a low priority, but we now see in the 2000s how critical is the domain of space for our nation. And who is in charge of this, again, as an agency? Who runs this? So today's policy, our policy, as signed in December of 2017, basically says we need to act responsibly in space because the stability, security, and free access space is vital to our national interests. How important is that to us? You see this as an advent, amplifying what was done in 2010, of the result of seeing China do a direct ascent and destroying one of their own satellites. And what does that mean to us as a nation? How do we deal with that now, understanding that they can hold our systems hostage? Facilitate the growth of commercial space. I mean, if you think about this, we have an International Space Station. How do we get supplies up there? SpaceX. And you see SpaceX now doing these launches. You see, well, there's a Tesla Roadster out there now. But the whole advent of we want to go to Mars. Who's leading that charge? Well, it's in the new space policy, but who's leading that charge? Well, we just saw NASA launch the InSight space vehicle that is going to actually be telling us a little bit more about the composition of Mars. But you see SpaceX saying, we're going to put people there. Everyone has the right to use space. However, do not interfere with somebody else's means, because it's still for peaceful purposes. And we will assure access to space for all responsible parties. North Korea, Iran. And we will defend our systems as necessary. And when you get deeper into the policy, you start looking at, quote unquote, intersector guidelines. And you say, strengthen U.S. leadership, maintain our ability to do position, navigation, and timing. Have space professionals working for who? Which agency? Who's in charge? Strengthen interagency partnerships. I mean, it's right there in the national policy. Okay, interagency partnerships, preserve the space environment. And here's an interesting piece. You got this thing that says, develop space collision warning measures. Just last month, this is very interesting, the organization that was responsible for space situational awareness and telling everybody that, you know, you've got a satellite that's going to come in conjunction with another satellite was the Department of Defense. It was at the Joint Space Operations Center in Vandenberg Air Force Base that has just been moved by the National Space Council to the Department of Commerce. You look at that and say, Department of Commerce trying to make sure that understanding who's going to be in trouble if satellites are coming close to each other or junk's coming close to each other, they're the ones that have to warn everybody. So that kind of shows you the change and the drift of going from a governmental piece to an industry economic piece versus who's in charge now. So as we look at the space environment, we see this as a very contested. I mean, if you think about this, the United States is in space. Who else has a space presence that we have to worry about? How many countries actually have a satellite in space? Today, we're looking at about 78 countries. Actually, it may even be 80 as of today. Who of those are our friends? Who of those are your enemies? Who are you playing nice with, and who are you trying to watch that are not playing nice with us? So you start thinking about this. This is a very contested environment. And, oh, by the way, how much stuff is in space? I mean, working satellites-wise, you're talking about 1,700, 1,800 working satellites. We're easily looking at about 40,000 items we can actually track through radars, telescopes, and satellites that are up there tracking that stuff. But I would say there's probably 500,000 items up there when you get to paint chips and bolt heads and separation rings and fairings and rocket bodies and debris from China shooting down their own satellite. There's the peaceful use of space for you. And so you start seeing this. How long will it be before this becomes Wall-E? And then what does that mean? Will we actually even be able to access space systems if they start getting destroyed by other space stuff that's up there? And when do we finally get to the Kessler effect? It all starts getting crazy. And then, what's this mean to us as a nation economically? We spent years building the International Space Station. We had a shuttle. We went to the moon with humans. We put humans into space. We got the guys up on the International Space Station. We're bringing stuff up. We built that with the shuttle transport system, and this was incredibly cool. How do astronauts get up to the International Space Station today? Russia, how much for the round-trip taxi fare? Oh, let's take out of your treasury, your tax dollars, here's $76 million I'm going to hand to Vladimir and say, here you go, take my guy up, bring him back. And, well, wait a minute, aren't we in the middle of economic sanctions with Russia? Aren't we trying to delimit their capability economically based upon their actions around the world? And now we're just giving them money to do that? Oh, here's one other piece. You want to talk about national security. Our Atlas rockets, the engines for them are RD-180s made in Russia. They make really good engines. I mean, they make really good engines. And it's inexpensive for us to buy them, but we buy a lot of them. And there you go, more money going into there. So, Advent. How do we get supplies up to the International Space Station now? Supplies. SpaceX. So now I take that money out of the treasury, I hand it to my American company, and I tax the crap out of it. And they're launching for other countries and other companies and bringing in other people's money. And that grows our economic infrastructure and our economic prowess. And it takes away a dependency that we need to go to somebody else to launch to get our stuff up there. That's a pretty sharp thing to do. Grow the commerce, grow the ability. So when you start looking at our capabilities as a nation, who's the threat? Who's playing in space? What's that mean to our national security? Who's in charge of putting that all together? I mean, how well do all the agencies come together to work this? What are the threats? And oh, by the way, it's not even who is the threat. You have to start thinking about what's the threat. When you talk about being up in that environment, and how will that affect our ability to support our nation through the domain of space? There's some pretty tough questions to ask. How dependent are we on space? When's the last time you actually pulled out a map instead of used your GPS? When's the last time you actually read a book rather than turned on the telecommunicator? How many are using a cell phone and don't even have a landline connected by wires in their house anymore? What are other nations' intentions for us? How much do they recognize how dependent we are on a space-based capability? What are the cyber implications if they're going to try and infect our comm systems that go through space, or our navigation and timing capabilities? What's the implications? Are there other systems that can be brought to bear in what we do? We as a nation have to really start thinking about the domain of space, our dependencies, and who's in charge. Right now, Congress has been talking and put in the National Defense Authorization Act that we ought to establish a Department of Space in the military. It has since been put on a back shelf. The Department of Defense said we really don't need that now. I mean, we used to have a U.S. Space Command. We no longer have that. So who's really doing space? And, oh, by the way, if you think about this, if you go back, way back in history to global exploration, who was in charge of global exploration? It were commercial entities. It was privateers. It was folks going out trying to find tea roots and trying to find gold and and it was the commercial entities going out and discovering the world. And then government followed and said they started taking that over. But if you look at space, it's kind of a little different. Governments started going into space because that's who could afford it, and they signed the treaties and they signed the laws. But now, who's really taken the forefront of space? It's the commercial entities. It's the commercial providers. It's the people buying Google Earth imagery. It's telecommunications. It's all that stuff that they're doing from a commercial vector. What law are they signed to? They didn't sign a treaty. Who's holding them responsible? What does that mean when you say what you can and cannot do in space that is dominated by law? How is a commercial entity held to this? So my apologies for today, because all I've done is left you with a lot of questions. And I have not identified any one entity that's in charge of the domain of space. But I would tell you this, much like the most important thing in the room here, which is air, oxygen, you don't think about oxygen, you just breathe. You don't think about space-based capabilities and how much you use them every day and how important they are to our national security. We just use it. So which agency is in charge of space? I would tell you, not a one. Which agency depends on space and uses space and needs space to be able to put forth our national security, our intelligence agencies, our transportation agencies, our total national health probably relies on every one of these agencies recognizing where their equities are in the space venue and how they need to work at protecting, securing, and engaging our domain to ensure our national security. Pursuant to your questions, I conclude this brown bag lecture.
If you have questions, please turn on the microphones in front of you.
Tom, just a question specifically, the non-binding United Nations agreement signed by 104 nations. So what happens if they violate that agreement?
What happens if a nation violates any treaty? Who's the enforcer? I believe, and this is, just me thinking, you enforce yourself. You sign to a treaty saying, these are the rules I'm going to plan by. But then again, if you also think about this, if two nations go into conflict, they're not bound by the treaties because they're in conflict. So I believe that the space treaty, like any other treaty, is self-regulated because there is no UN police force. I would think if you do violate it and you can get a preponderance of nations, then they can, do the démarche and they can do, what happens? They write a strongly worded document, they send it through, get all their pals to sign it, and then they say, hey, bad nation for doing that. That's not the way you should do that business. And so, who enforces? That's another good thing to think about. How well should we protect our own, because who else is going to protect it? I don't know. Thank you for that. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I had noticed several slides regarding policy, and my thought was, are those put in a document somewhere, and then who would put that document out or be responsible for it?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, the National Space Policy is actually produced by the administration, and it is signed by the president. And so that, for example, the 2017 policy, it is actually signed, and I'm trying to remember the exact date, but it's December of 2017, signed by President Trump. The one prior to that was 2010, signed by President Barack Obama. So it is the presidential policy. President Obama was actually the first to then establish a national space security strategy on that policy back in 2012. President Trump has announced that he has done a national space security strategy in March of this year. However, the only thing I can find so far is a fact sheet that says this is what, the facts of the strategy. I have not been able to find it, but policy is actually signed by the president. I would also tell you this, it kind of rolls downhill. So when you get the president signs his national space policy, you then get a Department of Defense that says, okay, I've looked at everything. He says, here is our space policy for Department of Defense. And then you watch it roll downhill, and each one of the services has their policy regarding space. So there is actually an Army policy, there a Navy policy, and an Air Force policy, et cetera, that rolls downhill. But it all starts at the very top. Here's the policy for my nation as it's put together by the administration. Yes, sir.
You've said no one's in charge. What would be your recommendations then? How should the United States government approach space?
I didn't anticipate that question. Who would I say should be in charge of space? It is a very difficult question because it permeates everything. It permeates everything. When you look, the intel community needs space for different reasons, for different whys. The telecommunications world, the FCC and International Telecommunications Union, the International Electrical Engineers, all use the comm side for different means. If I'm talking about helping USAID go into a country to help them do internal development, what do they need? How do they need? Who should be in charge? Who would be able to turn to them and say, no, you don't get that because that's not important? Well, wait a minute. Who should be in charge? I think for the national security, to be able to protect our systems, if you're going to defend, deter, defeat, boy, that sure sounds like a Department of Defense thing for me. But if I'm talking about national intelligence means and things like that, well, should that be a Department of Defense? Should that be the Director of National Intelligence? And I don't know as if what we have isn't probably pretty good right now for how it works. But when the threat starts coming in, that's going to be a very interesting piece. Because if you look at, for example, Russia, they have actual space security force, and they tie everything under a space force. China has just done the thing just a little while ago. They have established, they have split the PLA, and they have a national space security force. However, like us, their space exploration is kind of separate, but they're more tied to the PLA than you would see NASA and the Department of Defense. Two different things, two different budgets, two different ways, as with all of these agencies. So I don't know as if I have a good answer. Thank you. Anybody else? Well, yes, sir.
When you listed people playing in space,
Yes, sir.
you did not list the European Space Agency and some other people we might consider friends. Was there a reason for that?
Yeah, I really just tried to focus on who the threat was. If I'm talking about national security, not really, you know, it goes back to the who's friends, who's enemies. Personally, I think at some point they're all frenemies. Well, you know, if you really think about it, who have we not been in conflict with at some point in time? And, you know, people who are enemies then are friends now. People who are friends now may have been, you know, or enemies now may have been friends before. And it's, you know, we had a great different relationship with China before, with Russia before, with England before, with France before. I mean, Germany, they're all different. So, and the other side to that is there are more consortia in space than there are nations. I mean, you look at ESA, that's a whole bunch of countries together. And that doesn't mean the member countries of ESA, or European Space Agency, don't have their own stuff too. So yeah, this gets to be very difficult when you start talking about which companies are going to be really masters in space. And how do you deal as a nation with companies? That's going to be an interesting piece. I hope that answered it. Well then, thank you very much. Oh, sir.
You had mentioned the Space Council
Yes, sir.
earlier. Are all these entities on the Space Council?
No, there are, so the National Space Council, which has been reformulated after 28 years of being let go, has been reestablished by the current administration. It is headed up by the Vice President. So Vice President Pence is the chair of the National Space Council, and the National Space Council is an entity that's trying to look at the totality of the space domain as how it relates to our nation. And there are several administrative and senatorial and agency members to that council, to include Department of Defense and intelligence agencies and things like that. It does not represent every agency, however. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate you being here. Thank you. And I would engender you, if possible, to please attend these other Simon Center events that are going on that are supported by the foundation of the Command and General Staff College. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for being here. Have a great day. Thank you, sir.